What happened when one man changed history forever? The old man's eyes, rheumy with age and a lifetime of regret, stared out at the bustling market square. Pigeons strutted boldly across the cobblestones, oblivious to the weight of history that hung heavy in the air. For Elias Thorne, every creaking cart, every shouted vendor, every peal of distant church bells was a phantom echo of a world that no longer existed, a world he had unwittingly, or perhaps inevitably, erased. He was the ghost in his own life, a man who had changed history forever, and now lived in its altered shadow, a silent observer of a vibrant, yet deeply unfamiliar present. His story, the one he dared not speak aloud, began not with grand declarations or world-shattering inventions, but with a simple, almost insignificant act of compassion on a cold, blustery day in London, 1888. It was a day etched into the fabric of his memory, not for any dramatic event, but for a quiet, personal decision that, in retrospect, had the force of a tidal wave. The ripple in the Thames. A minor act, a major shift. The year 1888 was a tempestuous beast, particularly in London. Jack the Ripper stalked the fog-shrouded alleys of Whitechapel. Industrial smog choked the air, and the chasm between the opulent rich and the desperately poor yawned wider than ever. Elias Thorne, then a young idealistic physician, fresh out of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, felt the city's pulse with an agonizing intensity. He saw the suffering, the squalor, the preventable deaths, and a fierce, almost revolutionary zeal burned within him. He believed in progress, in science, in the inherent dignity of every human life. He dreamed of a world where such disparities were a relic of the past, where public health was paramount, and where every child had a fair chance. On that fateful October afternoon, a biting wind whipped off the Thames, carrying with it the stench of coal smoke and despair. Elias was hurrying along the embankment, a worn leather satchel clutched in his hand, on his way to a charity clinic in the East End. His thoughts were consumed by a particularly grim case of consumption he'd seen that morning. He was late, and his mind was already mapping out treatment plans, calculating dosages, and wondering if he could secure warmer blankets for his patients. Suddenly, a small, emaciated figure stumbled directly into his path. It was a girl, no older than 7, dressed in rags, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide with a hunger that twisted Elias's gut. She clutched a half-eaten moldy apple like a precious jewel, her small hand white-knuckled around it. Her name, he would later learn, was Mary. She looked as though she hadn't had a proper meal in days, her thin frame shivering despite the meager layers she wore. In his haste, Elias bumped her, and the apple, her only sustenance, tumbled from her grasp, rolling across the grimy pavement and into a gutter filled with refuse. A sob tore from the child's throat, a sound of such profound hopelessness and utter devastation that it froze Elias in his tracks. It was a sound that articulated a world of deprivation more eloquently than any lecture or report. Other passers-by, inured to the casual cruelty of poverty, simply skirted around them, their faces impassive, their footsteps hurrying past the small tragedy. But Elias couldn't. He saw not just a dirty street urchin, but a human being, a child, whose world had just been shattered by the loss of a rotten apple. He envisioned the desperate scramble she must have gone through to acquire it, the gnawing hunger it represented. Without a second thought, his medical training taking a back seat to his inherent empathy, he bent down, retrieved the apple from the muck, and wiped it as best he could with his handkerchief, though its moldy spots remained evident. Then, reaching into his own coat pocket, he pulled out a pristine, unblemished apple he'd been saving for his own lunch, a rare luxury for a young, struggling doctor. "Here," he said, his voice gentle, devoid of condescension. "Take this one. It's much better." Mary stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with disbelief, then suspicion, and finally a fragile hope. No one had ever shown her such unsolicited kindness, especially not someone in a respectable coat. She hesitantly took the apple, her small fingers, surprisingly delicate despite their grime, brushing his. Elias smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes, a flicker of the idealism that drove him. "Be careful now," he advised, a simple, human gesture of concern, and continued on his way, the incident already fading from his mind, a brief, unremarkable act of charity in a day filled with medical emergencies. He felt a fleeting warmth, a small victory against the tide of misery, and nothing more. He thought nothing more of it. It was a small ripple in the vast, churning ocean of London life. But that ripple, unknown to Elias, was about to become a tsunami that would redraw the geopolitical map of the world. The butterfly effect. Diverging paths. What Elias didn't know was that Mary, clutching her fresh apple, was minutes away from a chance encounter that would have, in the original timeline, altered her path irrevocably. She was destined to be spotted by a particular individual, a minor but crucial figure in the burgeoning socialist movement of the time, a man named Thomas O'Malley. O'Malley, an Irish immigrant with a fiery spirit and a heart for social justice, was a charismatic orator and a tireless advocate for the working class. He and his intellectual partner, a brilliant but notoriously reclusive political theorist named Eleanor Wentz, were setting up one of London's first communal living experiments. This commune aimed to provide not just shelter and food, but also education and a sense of dignity for working-class children, offering them an escape from the brutal streets and factories. In the original timeline, Mary, witnessing her own utter destitution and the stark contrast of O'Malley's offer, would have accepted his hand, quite literally. She would have joined the commune, a scared but hopeful recruit. There, inspired by the community's ideals and the passionate teachings of O'Malley and Wentz, she would have blossomed. She possessed a keen intellect, a photographic memory, and a fierce, innate sense of justice that resonated deeply with the socialist principles she was exposed to. She devoured books, learned to read and write with astonishing speed, and found her voice in the impassioned debates around the communal hearth. She would have gone on to become a leading light in the early 20th century women's suffrage movement, a powerful orator whose speeches moved crowds to tears and action. Her articulate arguments and strategic mind, honed by Wentz's tutelage, would have been instrumental in accelerating the passage of workers' rights legislation across Europe and North America. Her influence, although often behind the scenes, bridging divides between radical factions and more moderate reformers, would have been instrumental in preventing several major industrial disputes from escalating into violent confrontations, subtly steering the course of socio-economic development towards greater equity. She was in essence a crucial unifying force in an era of intense social upheaval. But Elias Thorne gave her an apple, a fresh, red, unblemished apple. Because she had a good apple, she wasn't quite as desperate. Her immediate gnawing hunger was satiated, her stomach no longer cramping with emptiness. The unexpected kindness of the doctor, a fleeting moment of human warmth, had paradoxically lowered her guard. When she finally found a relatively quiet corner of a park and sat, carefully eating her apple, savoring every bite, she appeared less frantic, less utterly destitute. While she sat there, two men, seemingly respectable in their bowler hats and dark coats, approached her. They were talent scouts, not for the stage, but for a burgeoning network of petty criminals who exploited children for their dexterity, small size, and perceived innocence. They specialized in pickpocketing, petty theft, and running coded messages through the city's underbelly. They saw her stillness, her delicate features, her perceived vulnerability, and recognized not a child in need of rescue, but a child with potential for their illicit trade. They offered her a shiny shilling, a warm meal right now, and a promise of easy work, a far more immediate and tangible offer than O'Malley's more abstract vision of communal living and future ideals. In her originally desperate state, she might have been more wary, more distrusting of such overt advances. But with the unexpected kindness of the doctor still fresh in her mind and her stomach full, her guard was slightly lowered. She saw not danger, but immediate relief and, crucially, a way to survive. Right now. She had learned just minutes ago that a small act of generosity could change her immediate circumstances.
This was simply another one. Mary accepted. She vanished into the labyrinthine alleys of London's criminal underworld, her prodigious intellect redirected towards survival, evasion, and the intricate art of the street. The seemingly minor diversion, the simple act of giving an apple instead of allowing a moment of desperation to unfold differently, set off a chain reaction, a cascade of unforeseen consequences that would unravel the fabric of the future Elias Thorne knew. Like pulling a single thread from a complex tapestry. The unraveling threads, a world less just. Without Mary's powerful voice, her strategic mind, and her unique ability to bridge divides in the suffrage movement, the fight for women's voting rights became far more protracted and violent. The political will to concede was slower to build, and the tactics employed by the suffragettes, lacking Mary's diplomatic prowess and ability to unite disparate factions, often alienated potential allies. Without her calming influence and ability to articulate a clear, compelling vision for a more inclusive democracy, the movement became more fragmented, prone to internal squabbling, and more confrontational, leading to increased government crackdowns. The vote for women in Britain, instead of coming in 1918, was delayed until 1928, and even then, under more restrictive conditions, applying only to women over 30 who met property qualifications. Full equal suffrage wasn't achieved until 1938. This significant delay had a profound impact on subsequent political landscapes, slowing the adoption of social reforms that would have been championed by women in Parliament, such as improved public health initiatives, better education funding, and childcare provisions. More critically, without Mary's early insightful intervention in labor disputes, the industrial unrest of the early 20th century festered and exploded with unprecedented ferocity. The Great Strike of 1912, which in the original timeline was largely averted through Mary's skillful negotiation between unions and factory owners, a negotiation built on her unique understanding of both worker desperation and the economic realities of industry, instead escalated into a brutal, bloody conflict. Lacking a unifying, moderate voice like Mary's, union demands became more radical and employer responses more intransigent. The British Army was called in not just to maintain order, but to break the strike, resulting in dozens of deaths and hundreds of injuries. A deep, bitter, and enduring class resentment was sown that would scar British society for decades, poisoning industrial relations and fostering an atmosphere of suspicion and antagonism. This, in turn, fueled more radical political movements, both communist and fascist, as disillusioned workers sought extreme solutions to what they perceived as a broken and uncaring system. The moderate Labour Party struggled to gain traction in a political environment increasingly polarized by class warfare. The ripple extended far beyond Britain's shores. The delay in widespread workers' rights legislation globally, caused by the absence of Mary's influential advocacy, meant that conditions in factories remained harsher for longer across Europe and North America. Child labor persisted in many areas for an additional decade, and worker exploitation was rampant. This led to a more widespread and deeply entrenched international socialist movement, but one that was more radical, less compromising, and often more prone to violent revolutionary rhetoric, precisely because the peaceful, democratic avenues for change had been effectively blocked or severely curtailed. The intellectual arguments for gradual reform, often articulated by figures like the original Mary, were never fully developed or widely accepted. Instead, the discourse was dominated by calls for revolutionary overthrow. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, continued his life, oblivious to the profound alterations unfolding around him. He distinguished himself in medicine, pioneering new aseptic techniques and tirelessly advocating for public health reforms, driven by the same idealism that led him to give the apple. He lived through the First World War, horrified by the carnage, but still believing in humanity's slow, inexorable march towards progress. He saw the rise of new technologies, the Jazz Age, the Great Depression. He noticed subtle shifts, perhaps, in the political discourse, a harsher edge, a more cynical tone, a lingering bitterness in the newspapers, but attributed it to the natural ebb and flow of history, the scars left by war and economic hardship. He couldn't possibly conceive that his small act had orchestrated such a grand, tragic symphony. The echo of war, a fractured world. The Second World War arrived, as it must, but with a horrifying twist. Without the stable, broadly progressive political climate fostered by earlier social reforms, the conditions were ripe for more extremist ideologies to take root. The delayed women's suffrage meant that many progressive social policies that would have strengthened democratic institutions and fostered greater social cohesion were simply not enacted in time. Educational reforms, public housing initiatives, and welfare programs, which would have inoculated societies against the appeal of totalitarianism, were either absent or severely underdeveloped. In this altered timeline, the Nazi regime, rather than being met with a unified and morally resolute international front, found a Europe more fractured, more internally conflicted, and less willing to challenge aggression. The legacy of the Great Strike of 1912 and similar labor conflicts meant that in several European nations, particularly France and Italy, there was less national cohesion and more internal ideological division, weakening their resolve and military preparedness. France, for instance, was plagued by deeper political instability and a more pronounced us versus them mentality between its working classes and its government, impacting military morale and strategic thinking. Critically, the absence of Mary's influence meant that a brilliant, yet reclusive political theorist named Eleanor Vance, who, in the original timeline, had collaborated closely with Mary, finding in her a perfect conduit for her ideas, never found her full voice. Vance had contributed significantly to developing early frameworks for international cooperation in conflict resolution, advocating for institutions that prioritize diplomacy and collective security over unilateral action. Vance, a fierce opponent of nationalism and a proponent of multilateralism, had, through Mary's advocacy and popularization of her complex theories, been instrumental in shaping the intellectual bedrock of what would become the United Nations. In this altered reality, Vance, without Mary's connection, without that pragmatic voice to translate her abstract ideas into actionable policy and popular movements, faded into obscurity. Her meticulously crafted plans for post-war international order remained just that, plans on paper, never translated into political reality. The result? The League of Nations, already a fragile construct in the original timeline, was even weaker, lacking the intellectual and moral force to effectively counter aggression. It became a toothless organization, easily dismissed. Appeasement was not just a political strategy, it was a deeply ingrained cultural malaise, a symptom of a broader societal fragmentation and a profound lack of unified international leadership.
There was no strong, popular movement pushing for intervention, no moral consensus to stand against rising fascism. When Hitler invaded Poland, the response was hesitant, disunited, and ultimately ineffective. France, riddled with internal strife and a legacy of deep class resentment, fell faster and more completely than even in the original history, its political will crumbling from within. Britain stood alone, but with a more isolationist and less internationally minded political class, scarred by a decade of internal labor unrest and political infighting. The spirit of Dunkirk was still present, but the broader geopolitical landscape was far more grim. The United States was even more reluctant to enter the fray, lacking the moral impetus that a unified Europe and strong international advocacy groups would have provided. The war lasted longer. The atrocities were even more widespread and prolonged. Without the rapid development of certain Allied technologies, which were in part spurred by earlier social and scientific cross-pollination that, ironically, Marion Vance's original influence had indirectly encouraged, the conflict dragged on for an additional 2 grueling years, extending into 1947. The death toll was significantly higher, and the scale of destruction across Europe and Asia was even more catastrophic. The Holocaust, instead of being partially curtailed by the war's end in 1945, continued its horrific machinery for 2 more years, claiming millions more lives. Elias Thorne, by then an elderly man, long retired from medicine, living a quiet life in a small London flat, often found himself staring at the newspaper headlines, a profound unease settling in his soul. The world felt harder, harsher, more prone to conflict. The promised age of progress seemed to have stalled, replaced by an ever-present fear of annihilation. There was no significant environmental movement, no global push for human rights. The concept itself in its modern form was stunted, and scientific advancements, while still impressive, were overwhelmingly focused on military technology, with less emphasis on public health, sustainable energy, or space exploration for peaceful purposes. He mourned the loss of a future he had once envisioned, a future where humanity, despite its flaws, continually strived for something better, a world that now seemed a distant, impossible dream. He began to notice other smaller yet profoundly unsettling differences. The literature of his youth, the poetry, the plays, they seemed to carry a different cadence, a darker undercurrent reflecting a more cynical and disillusioned society. The optimism of the Victorian era had curdled into a pervasive fatalism. Popular culture celebrated individualistic stoicism and distrust, rather than collective action and empathy. Even the architecture seemed different. Buildings were more utilitarian, less ornate, reflecting a society that prioritized function and survival over aesthetic beauty or communal spaces. It was in his 90th year, frail and almost blind, that Elias Thorne stumbled upon the truth. He was sifting through old papers, letters from his youth, faded photographs, his mind a quiet, dusty archive of a long life. He found a diary he had kept as a young physician, meticulously chronicling his daily rounds, his observations of the city, his hopes and frustrations. One entry, dated October 1888, caught his attention. It detailed a series of visits to the East End, the grim conditions, the pervasive poverty, his frustrations with bureaucracy. And then a small, almost illegible scribble at the bottom, an afterthought. Encountered small girl, Mary, lost apple, gave her mine, poor soul. It was a throwaway line, an insignificant detail that had been buried under a century of memories. But something about it tugged at a distant, half-forgotten memory, a flicker of something different, a jarring discord in the symphony of his life. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet darkness of his mind, a different scene played out, one he vaguely remembered from a forgotten dream, or perhaps a ghost of the original timeline. He saw the child Mary stumbling, but this time there was no apple given. This time she looked up,
desperate, and was met by a stern yet concerned man, Thomas O'Malley, who offered her a leaflet about the socialist commune, his voice gruff but kind, his hand extended in an offer of genuine aid. He saw Mary hesitate, then nod, a spark of resolve in her young eyes. He saw a different future unfold, a future he had once lived, or rather a future that should have been. He opened his eyes, his heart pounding with a sudden terrifying clarity. He saw it all laid out like a spectral map of possibilities and divergences. The butterfly effect, a concept he'd read about in speculative fiction, was now staring at him in the face, a brutal, undeniable reality. His simple act of kindness, born of pure compassion, had derailed a crucial nexus point in history, redirecting the flow of human events onto a far darker course. He remembered reading about Mary, the formidable labor organizer, the eloquent suffragette, the champion of social justice, the hundreds of lives she had spearheaded, the societal changes she had spearheaded, the countless lives she had uplifted in the history books of his youth. He remembered her name, her face from newspaper etchings, her powerful speeches, and the societal changes she had spearheaded, the countless lives she had uplifted.
But in this world, the history books mention no such person. There was no great reformer Mary, no architect of global welfare. That timeline had diverged profoundly and irrevocably. He was the man who had changed history forever. And he had done so with an apple, a simple, fresh, red apple. The weight of it crashed down upon him, suffocating him. The prolonged wars, the heightened suffering, the deeply entrenched class struggles, the constant threat of nuclear annihilation, the harshness of this present reality, it was all in some unfathomable, horrifying way connected to his one benevolent act. He hadn't unleashed a plague or started a war. He had given a hungry child an apple, a gesture of pure, unadulterated human empathy. And it had, indirectly, cost the world untold suffering. He was not a hero. He was a paradox, a well-intentioned destroyer, a compassionate agent of chaos. The bitter irony of it was almost unbearable. Elias Thorne lived for another 5 years, carrying this immense secret. He watched the world with a new, agonizing clarity, a prism of alternate realities constantly before his mind's eye. He saw the lack of robust social safety nets, the lingering, often violent class divisions, the environmental degradation accelerating unchecked, the constant palpable threat of international conflict, and knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was not supposed to be this way. He saw the ghosts of a better future in every shadow. He saw the faces of the people in the market square, their lives shaped by events he had inadvertently set in motion. He saw their resilience, their fleeting joys, their everyday struggles, and a profound, bone-deep sadness enveloped him. They were living in a world born of his kindness, a world that was undeniably worse than the one that could have been, a world diminished by the absence of one powerful guiding voice. He often wondered, if he had known, that day on the embankment, the full, devastating consequences of his choice, would he have withheld the apple? Would he have allowed the child to go hungry, knowing it might lead to a better future for millions? A future free from 2 extra years of world war? From the ever-present threat of nuclear winter? From decades of brutal class struggle? It was a question that tore at his soul, an ethical dilemma of monstrous proportions.
The utilitarian calculus of it was horrifying. To deny a starving child, in the present, a tangible act of kindness for an abstract, unseen future good. It seemed monstrous, a negation of his very being as a doctor, as a compassionate human. And yet, the consequences of his compassion were equally monstrous, playing out on a global scale. He was trapped between two unbearable truths. He never spoke of it. Who would believe him? He would be dismissed as a madman, a delusional old fool. His story too incredible, too fantastical to be anything but the ramblings of a senile mind. So he carried his burden in silence, a living ghost in a timeline he had inadvertently crafted, a prisoner of his own empathy. The truth was his alone, a crushing weight in his final years. When he finally passed away in his sleep, a century after his fateful act, in a small, quiet room overlooking the gray London streets, the world barely noticed. A small obituary in a local paper noted the passing of Dr. Elias Thorne, a respected, if somewhat eccentric, retired physician. No mention was made of his true legacy. The man who changed history forever, the accidental architect of a harder, more cynical world, faded into an altered past. His singular, profound impact a secret, known only to the silent echoes of time itself. The pigeons still strutted in the market square. The world, irrevocably changed, continued its relentless march, unaware of the small, kind hand that had, with a single apple, nudged it onto a darker, more perilous path, forever altering the destiny of nations and the very spirit of humanity. It was a stark, chilling reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can carry the largest, most unintended consequences.